Hello, and welcome back to the Prince William Sound Natural History Symposium. My name is Heather Pham, and I'll be your host for this session. We have two presenters in this concurrent session. Feel free to make any comments in the chat box and try to put your questions for the speakers in the Ask a Question tab that's down below. And I'll try to keep an eye on both. Our first presenter is Ted Spencer, who will provide a brief overview of the recorded history in Whittier and the Prince William Sound region. Ted Spencer is a fifth-generation Alaskan raised in Fairbanks, Nome, and Anchorage. He is the executive director of the Prince William Sound Museum in Whittier, Alaska. He was an independent small business owner from 1970 to 1988 and was the founder and executive director of the Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum at Lake Hood. He is also the executive director and executive design and construction contractor at Wings Over Alaska. Ted Spencer, please, we want to welcome you.
All right, we have got Ted Spencer on the phone here. And while he's speaking, I am going to put up a historical photo of Whittier while he is joining us on the phone. Take it away, Ted.
It's going to be an abbreviated dissertation, so if you wanted to learn more about the story of Whittier and the heritage of the town, you could always come out there to Whittier and visit us at the museum. There's displays around town, walking tours, and also in the BTI there's a chronological display on the wall. Whittier, prior to its creation, was a region for the original peoples that populated the region, the native folks. And the principal tribe identities were the Chugach natives, the Aleut natives, which came from the Aleutians and migrated east to Kodiak area and would venture into the Prince William Sound area. There were also tribes from the north, the Eaks, that were associated with the Athabascan. And then from the eastern regions, you had the southeastern native tribes such as Haidas and Tlinkits. I don't pretend to be an expert on the native evolution, but I note their presence in the area. They had the place all to themselves until the 1700s, when we had a variety of European-oriented cultures investigating the region.
Whoops, I apologize. We've got some... Hold on. Some interference from the other session. Please continue.
Okay. One group of people of note that very few people know much about are the Spanish. They started coming to Alaska in the mid to late 1700s. And there was a decree by the Pope in 1508 that the Spanish owned the entirety of the New World, since they were one of the original discoverers of it from across the ocean. And of course, they gave Brazil to the Portuguese. But the Spanish were centered pretty much in the warm climates of Mexico. Hello?
A little more interference. It should be done now. Please continue. I apologize.
Okay, that's all right. So the Spanish showed up in their galleons, the San Carlos, and this was a ship that was built in the Philippines, sailed across the Pacific, and was based at San Blas on the western coast of Mexico. And a sea captain by the name of Hidalgo brought this ship to Prince William Sound, and was actually the first ship to penetrate deep into Prince William Sound, and hence we have the names of Valdez and Cordova applied to some of the regions in Prince William Sound. They endured a number of these expeditions and fought mosquitoes and bad weather and whatnot, and decided pretty much to stay in Mexico, and they ceded the region to the Russians and the British to some degree. They negotiated the transfer of some of the region to the British at Vancouver Island. The place was rarely visited by the Western cultures until later on, when they were attracted by the need to explore Alaska by virtue of the purchase from Russia and the seeking of gold. And that was one of their primary inspirations. And what became an important passageway is what is now known as Passage Canal. Back in the day, it was known as the Portage Bay, and it was the access to the Portage Pass Trail. The reason why the Portage Pass Trail is important is because it's the shortest distance from Prince William Sound through the mountains and the trees to Turnagain Arm, which led the way into the interior of Alaska. And one of the most notable early expeditions was a Major Edwin Glenn, who landed on the beach there at the head of the bay and set up an encampment. And he sent out small groups of troops. These were all U.S. Army troops, to explore and map Alaska in the regions that they could access. They were followed by another significant group, the Alaska Engineering Commission expedition, and they sent a team through, and their goal was to determine a way forward for the railroad that they had envisioned from Seward into the interior of Alaska. And along the way, they took a look at the region that is now Whittier, and they determined that it was a feasible idea to create a tunnel through Maynard Mountain. And the region that is now Whittier was known as a government town site. These notations occur on a 1914 map that they created showing the proposed rail line. This was prior to Anchorage being created. And this vision of Whittier being a rail port languished until about 1941, when world events dictated the need for Alaska to have a credible deep water ice-free port. And the military at Fort Richardson contacted a local engineer by the name of Anton Anderson, and they petitioned him rather informally, I thought, reading his diary. And he agreed to honcho the building of this tunnel. He had experience building tunnels in the U.S., and he was a railroad buff, self-educated, and was a credible railroad engineer. So this caused him to take a boat with 6 men and land at the head of the bay on the beach in April of 1941, and their goal was to clear a space for a tent camp, which they set up, and they used this tent camp to bring in more people that could build even more tents, and then bringing in more people, start building structures to house and feed people, until they had a workforce that enabled them to build a dock off the end of the beach up at the head of the bay. And when the dock was completed, the ships, they were able to, because of the deep water, they were able to bring in major ships, steamships, Alaska steamships in particular, to unload equipment and massive amounts of supplies. In September of 41, they began ceremoniously started drilling through the tunnel, or drilling the tunnel from both sides of Maynard Mountain. Bear Valley to the north, and or I guess that would be the west, and the Passage Canal side from its present location. And this went on for from the fall of 1941 until the fall of 1942 in November, when they finally broke through the mountain. And it took another 5 months to put in the rail capability, but at the end of the day, in the spring of 43, Whittier became a rail port. While all this tunnel activity was taking place, they were busy building these heavy docks, and they were mining or harvesting lumber from, or trees from Port Wells, in particular at Asia Bay, and floating them down to the Whittier site. In 1943, an entrepreneur out of Juneau's initiated the building of a sawmill to mill all of this lumber coming through, and created the Columbia Lumber Mill. And so pretty much by the end of World War II, Whittier had been built up. They brought in a tremendous amount of troops for that area. They built a lot of wood barrack buildings. And they had one cement building, which was the radio communications building, and it still exists there today. It's the Anchor Inn restaurant. And they but pretty much lived in these wooden structures. And at the end of World War II, there was a big, massive pullout, and the base was all but abandoned. But then the events of the Cold War caused a resurgence of the military presence there. And when they came back in 1946-47, they embarked on a major capital building construction program. Hence, we have the Buckner building, which was started in 1949 and completed in 53. And then shortly thereafter, they started working on the Hodge building, which is known today as the BTI, and the gymnasium, which is being used today as a boathouse. And this housing replaced a unique residential area made up of trailers and wanigans that were buried in the snow every winter, with just a smokestack sticking out. And I thought it was kind of interesting that this is the area for the married personnel, so that the man and wife teams that were servicing in Whittier would live in these trailers. And I thought it was a true test of the marriage, that they could endure a long winter buried in the snow in these little trailers. A tremendous amount of money was expended to build up this facility, and it resulted in a tank farm being built in 1949, mostly by Morrison Knudsen Construction Company, beefing up of the rail yard, and they used a variety of train configurations, both steam and diesel. And their primary mission was to supply the military with the materials that they needed for to engage in the Cold War with the Russians. Thousands of troops came and went through this base over the years, and they endured all kinds of winters, much like the winter that just passed, with heavy snows, heavy winds. And they didn't have the facilities and communications capability that we have today. So it was pretty tough sledding for these people. But surprisingly, in communicating with the veterans, they praised their experience there. They found it vigorous and hardy to endure the conditions. and are proud of their service. We have a few veterans exhibits within the museum where they can be quoted as their good experience there in Whittier. With the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles and other technological things, Whittier's role as a military base became obsolete about 1960, and military decided to pull out. And as they left behind the lumber mill, the tank farm, which supplied a pipeline that went through the mountains to Anchorage for providing fuel for the early jets out of Elmendorf. And they, for some reason, they didn't want to leave anything behind that was capable of being destroyed, so they proceeded to bulldoze and burn all of the wood structures. This included barracks, churches, chow halls, community centers for troops. All kinds of infrastructure was demolished, but they didn't bother to attack the capital structures, the concrete buildings. Hence, today Whittier is a somewhat of a architectural museum from the Cold War era, and all of the buildings are still in service. We have created a walking tour for people that visit Whittier. They can walk around and look at these buildings and reflect on history. They have signs on them. And they're buildings like the BTI, the formerly known as the Hodge Building, have been renovated, and people live there, and it's touted as where all the people in the town live in a building. And on the other hand, the Buckner Building is desolate and destroyed. At the time it was built, it was called the City Under One Roof, and they had everything from bowling alleys to theaters to officers' lounges, a television station, jail. It was people could stay there and never have to leave the building. And when the military abandoned it, it passed into private hands, and it was envisioned as becoming the state prison at one point, and the developer thought that he had the decision in the bag, but when the new administration came aboard, they decided to place the prison in some other place. And so he basically abandoned the building, and it suffered overt, heavy-duty vandalism over the years, and it's a ghost sitting there now. It's currently contaminated and rather dangerous to even enter, and what its fate is hard to say. A lot of people have visions of maybe renovating it and putting it back in service, but it looks doubtful because of the cost. The civilians gradually migrated into all the infrastructure in the old military army port, and mostly railroad personnel, people that are interested in fishing. They capitalized on the harbor and the rail yards and the tunnel, and it's not clear who maintained all this beyond the railroad. The railroad had the primary interest in the community because of the railhead. And people were gradually filtering back into the region and occupying the spaces there. And then, of course, in March 1927, March 27th, 1964, Whittier got hit by the earthquake very hard. The epicenter for the earthquake was 33 miles from Whittier. And it wasn't really the earthquake that did any damage. Actually, they studied the buildings after the earthquake and found that they were lightly or not damaged at all by the earthquake. What created the damage was the tsunami, and the tsunami was generated by the collapse of underwater soils around the perimeter of Passage Canal, and it created 3 tsunamis. The second one was reputed to be 104 feet high, and the results of that, it totally destroyed the lumber mill that was there, which was pretty substantial, and it caused fatalities to 12 people that were in the lumber mill at the time. 6 of them were children. There's a monument to them out at in the waterfront in the business triangle at Whittier, if you want to look at that someday. And there was 2 other people that were injured or killed, and that was up at the other end of the shoreline. A woman and her infant. She was injured. The infant didn't survive. So a total of 13 people died during the earthquake, and it set fire to the tank farm and destroyed it. And it caused a fire that burned for some time. And Whittier was slow in rebuilding. They brought the rail capability back first, and the tunnel, of course, made it through okay. And the town slowly rebuilt itself back into serviceability, and the citizens that were there, they gathered enough force to form committees to incorporate Whittier as a 4th-class city. This took place in 1969, and officially became a civilian town. And in 1972, the citizens made a deal with the General Services Administration to buy all of the old military infrastructure. And this is what has created the foundation of the modern Whittier that we know today. And then in the 1980s, the cruise ships started coming in, and that's where we're at today. We're in what's known as a cruise ship era. And the community has been slowly building up the recreational infrastructure, trails and roads and whatnot to facilitate people visiting Whittier and enjoying all the beauty there, the kayaking and the fishing and hiking. So that's, in a nutshell, the history of Whittier. There's a lot more detail to it that is available through various publications and in exhibits that are being created in Whittier itself.
Thank you, Ted. Hey, I have a question for you.
Okay.
This is Heather. I'm the host. Since the tunnel opened to automobiles, like a little over 20 years ago, how has that changed or affected Whittier or Prince William Sound?
Well, the tunnel was a rail tunnel. It was designed as a rail tunnel, and I thought it was pretty innovative to try to envision vehicular traffic coming through. For many years, if you wanted to go to Whittier, you had to ride the train, and you'd get on the train at Portage, and you could get there was a ramp that you could drive your car onto it. What you do with your car when you got it to Whittier, I'm not sure. You could walk from one end of the town to the other in 20 minutes. But there was a lot of, and looking at the media of the day, there was a pro and con with the idea of bringing vehicular traffic through the tunnel. And they designed a passageway using a roadbed with the train tracks embedded in the roadbed. So both trains and vehicles could use it. People were worried that the town was so beautiful and full of so much fish and shrimp and crab and all that people would flood into the area and ruin it. So there was a very active opposition to the tunnel being created, but the people that wanted it to happen prevailed, and I believe it was in 2000 that the tunnel opened up to vehicular traffic, which facilitates the transport of everything. People go back and forth and use it, and it's a connection with Anchorage, so it makes the community a little less isolated, except when they can close the tunnel and people can't get in or out. So it's very unique. I don't know of another community on the planet that has these attributes.
Thank you, Ted. Great. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks so much. I don't see any other questions. Do you have anything else? We have a few minutes.
Well, do I have any time left?
You have a couple minutes.
Okay. Well, I'd like to encourage people that haven't been to Whittier or haven't spent much time. A lot of people come to Whittier and they're getting on a glacier tour boat or hopping on a boat to go fishing or going on the ferry, and they don't really get around in the town to examine details. But I think that if people have the time to examine all of these vestiges of history and enjoy there's remarkably good food in Whittier, and they do a lot of work on trails and whatnot that go up into the mountains. You get these very scenic views, and the place is just gorgeous. And it's an enjoyable place. I think in the future the town's going to become a major mecca. You have William Sound there, and you have all of this developed areas where you can hike. And there's some regions there that are unbelievably picturesque that I don't think have been that explored yet. You can kind of see them from the road. But I've been coming to the town for almost 20 years, and when I first came, I didn't know a thing about it, and didn't really have an impression other than it was very isolated and you couldn't get internet very easily. But I've watched it evolve over the last 20 years, and it's really a very special place.
Well, thank you so much, Ted. I think we're at that time. Really appreciate, sharing all that with us. Let's see, our next.
You're welcome.
Have a good day.